There is a word you have spoken out loud in English, a word for a spinning Atlantic storm that tears roofs from houses, that comes from the language of a people the history books declared dead 500 years ago. When you say hurricane, you are speaking a fragment of a tongue that officially has no living speakers. The people who first named that storm were counted, cataloged, and then written out of existence. And yet their word still rides the wind every summer across the Caribbean, spoken by millions who were told those who coined it were gone. This is the story of the Taíno, and it begins with a question history believed it had already answered. Before the ships came, the Taíno were the people of the Greater Antilles. They lived across the islands the world now calls Cuba, Hispaniola, Jamaica, and Puerto Rico. The island they themselves called Borican. They were farmers of the warm coast and the green interior valleys. They grew yuca, the starchy cassava root, and grated it and pressed the poison from it and baked it into flat white bread on clay griddles. They slept in woven cotton hammocks, another of their words that survives. They carved stone and wood and shell into small crouching figures called zemis, in which they believed the spirits of ancestors and gods took shelter. In their villages, they cleared wide rectangular plazas, bordered with upright stones, where they played a ball game on courts they called baytais. You can still walk one today at Caguana, in the mountains of Puerto Rico. The standing stones set exactly where Taíno hands placed them more than 700 years ago. They traveled the water in long dugout canoes, carved from single trunks, another word we kept from them. They read the sky and the sea and named the great storm after a force they feared, Hurricane. Theirs was not a small or simple world. It was a network of villages and chiefs, called caciques, spread across thousands of miles of blue water. And then, in the autumn of 1493, on his second voyage, Columbus returned to the Caribbean with 17 ships and hundreds of settlers, and the world of the Taíno began to close. For a long time, the story of what happened next seemed settled, and it was a story of complete and total loss. The Spanish built their first towns on Hispaniola and then on Borican. They imposed a system called the encomienda, which handed whole Taíno communities over to Spanish colonists as forced labor to dig gold from the rivers and work the new fields. Then came the diseases the Taíno had never met: smallpox, measles, influenza, illnesses to which they carried no immunity at all. The sicknesses moved faster than any army. Villages emptied. Whole districts fell silent. The record keepers counted the collapse. Early Spanish accounts described a population that had numbered in the hundreds of thousands, falling to a fraction of itself within a single generation. By the middle 1500s, colonial administrators simply stopped listing the Taíno as a separate people in their censuses. On paper, the category closed. Officials wrote that the indigenous population of the islands had ceased to exist. Textbooks for centuries afterward repeated the same grim, tidy sentence. The Taíno were extinct. The first people Europe ever met in the New World had, the books said, been erased from it entirely, leaving behind only place names, a handful of words, and ruins in the hills. And that was just the census, because the census counted communities and taxes and labor. It never counted blood. And when scientists finally learned to read the blood, the story the paper had closed came quietly back open. The first crack came from an island geneticist. In the early 2000s, a researcher named Juan Martínez-Cruzado at the University of Puerto Rico at Mayagüez set out to test the extinction story directly. He organized an island-wide genetic survey and gathered samples from roughly 800 residents drawn from across the whole of Puerto Rico. He was reading mitochondrial DNA, the small ring of genetic material passed down almost unchanged from a mother to every one of her children, a thread that runs backward, mother to mother to mother, across the centuries. If the Taíno were truly gone, that maternal thread would lead only to Europe and to Africa, to the Spanish colonists and the enslaved Africans brought later. That was the prediction of extinction. The data said something else entirely. When Martinez-Cruzado read those maternal lines, roughly 61% of the Puerto Ricans he sampled carried Native American mitochondrial DNA. Not a trace, not a rounding error. A clear majority of the island, on the direct maternal line, descended from indigenous women who were supposed to have vanished. The extinct people were, it turned out, the grandmothers of the living island. The data was answering a question the census had never thought to ask. The first thing the genetics confirmed was that the demographic catastrophe had been real. The Taíno men who resisted, who were worked to death in the mines and the fields, largely disappear from the genetic record. The maternal survival and the male collapse together tell the truth of the conquest plainly and without exaggeration. Indigenous women bore children into the households of colonists, sometimes by force, and their mitochondrial lines carried forward while so much else was destroyed. The DNA holds that history with dignity, and it does not look away. But confirming the disaster only sharpened the real puzzle. The maternal DNA proved that indigenous people had survived into the modern Puerto Rican. It could not, by itself, prove those survivors were specifically Taíno, or where the Taíno themselves had ultimately come from. For that, science needed to read a genome that was actually ancient. And here, the theories that had guided scholars for decades each opened, and each refused to fully close. The first theory said the Caribbean islands had been peopled from the north, drifting down from Florida and the North American mainland. It was plausible, and it never quite fit the pottery. The second theory followed the ceramics and the language southward. Archaeologists had long traced a distinctive painted pottery style, called Saladoid, after a site on the Orinoco, up the chain of the Lesser Antilles from South America. The Taíno language belonged to the great Arawakan family, whose other members lived along the rivers of Venezuela and the Amazon. This theory said the ancestors of the Taíno had paddled north from the South American mainland, island by island, over centuries. Strong as it was, it rested on pots and words, not on a body. Then, in 2018, a body finally spoke. A team led by Hannes Schroeder published a study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that had done what no earlier scientist could. They recovered a whole ancient genome from the tooth of a woman who had lived in the Caribbean about 1,000 years ago. Her remains found in Preacher's Cave on the island of Eleuthera in the Bahamas. This was not a fragment. It was the first high-quality ancient genome ever read from the pre-contact Caribbean. And when they compared her genome to living people's, two findings landed at once. Her closest living relatives were the Arawak-speaking peoples of northern South America, confirming that the ancestors of the Taíno had indeed come up out of the southern mainland. And, reaching forward in time, her ancient genome showed direct genetic continuity with present-day Caribbean populations. And the strongest signal of that continuity ran to the people of Puerto Rico. This is the twist that changes everything. A woman who died 1,000 years ago, whose people the empire declared extinct, was reaching through her own genome to touch the living islanders directly. And the record showed the line had never actually broken. The Taíno had not vanished. They had been absorbed, renamed, and administratively erased, while their blood walked on into the present under other names. Imagine standing in a small village high in the mountains of the interior of Borican, 3 or 4 generations after the ships first came. The coast below has been remade in a foreign image, but up here, the ridges are steep, and the roads are poor, and the empire's reach is thin. You are a woman here. Your grandmother spoke the old language and pressed the poison from the yucca, and knew the names of the zemis. A Spanish official has come through the valley with a ledger, counting souls for the tax and the labor. He writes down the households. He does not write down a people called Taíno, because his instructions say that people is finished. He records you as something else, a subject of the crown, a category on his page. You watch him close the book, and inside you, unrecorded and unbroken, runs a thread that stretches back through your mother and her mother all the way to a coastline in South America. A thread that will still be readable 500 years from now. That is the mechanism the genomes reveal. The extinction was real as an event and false as a fact. Epidemic disease and forced labor shattered Taíno society and killed a devastating share of its people, especially the men. But societies can be destroyed while lineages survive. The surviving indigenous women folded into colonial households in the isolated interior, passed their maternal DNA down through century after century of people who were no longer allowed to call themselves Taíno on any official form. The category died. The descent did not. What the census recorded as an ending was in truth a forced convergence, indigenous, European, and African, out of which the modern Puerto Rican was slowly born, carrying a majority indigenous maternal line the whole way. Today, in a mountain town like Jayuya, you can watch a woman grate cassava root over a screen, press the moisture from it exactly as her ancestors did, and bake the flat white cassave bread on a hot griddle. The same food by the same method that fed Borican 1,000 years before Columbus. She may have sent away a swab and read the result. She may have watched it name a Native American maternal line, a living confirmation of the extinct grandmother in the cave. In her hands, pressing the bread, is the answer the census never had the imagination to record. So return for a moment to the word in the wind, hurricane, Juracan, the name of the storm the Taíno feared and named and could not tame. For 500 years, we were told the people who spoke it were gone, wiped clean from the islands they had made their own. But the storm still carries their word, and the islanders still carry their blood. And the genome of a woman dead 1,000 years still reaches forward to claim her grandchildren by name. No lineage on these islands is pure, and no people is ever as easily erased as a ledger pretends. The Taíno were not a chapter that closed. They were a current that went underground and kept running, all the way to a living hand pressing bread in the mountains, all the way to a word you have spoken without knowing whose mouth first shaped it.